Per calorie, this leaf contains 7 times the protein of spinach, 6 times the iron, and more calcium than kale. It is a perennial that returns every spring for decades without replanting, grows in soil too poor for most crops, and has been harvested as food and fiber for at least 3,000 years. Bronze Age Europeans wove it into cloth. Roman soldiers carried it on campaign. Medieval peasants ate it when grain harvests failed. German armies wore uniforms made from it during 2 world wars. Then, in the second half of the 20th century, as industrial agriculture reorganized itself around crops that could be touched without pain, this plant was reclassified, not as food, but as enemy. This is a plant that defends itself. The leaves and stems are covered in fine, hollow hairs. When touched, these hairs break at the tip, forming a needle that injects a mixture of histamine, acetylcholine, serotonin, and formic acid into the skin. The sensation is immediate, a burning sting, followed by itching that can last for hours. The pain is not dangerous, but it is memorable. Once you have brushed against this plant, you do not forget. And yet, for most of human history, this was not a reason to avoid it. It was a reason to learn how to handle it. The plant has been used in Europe and Asia for at least 3 millennia. Textile fragments recovered from Bronze Age sites in Denmark and Sweden have been identified as woven from the fibers of this plant. The process was labor-intensive. Stalks were harvested, soaked, beaten, and combed to separate the long fibers, which were then spun and woven. The resulting cloth was strong, durable, and softer than linen. It was not a luxury fabric, but it was functional, and it was made from a plant that grew without cultivation in waste places, along ditches, near ruins, anywhere nitrogen had accumulated in the soil. The ancient Greeks and Romans knew the plant. Pliny the Elder described it. Dioscorides recorded its uses, both as food and as a treatment for inflammation. Roman soldiers stationed in cold northern regions practiced urtication, flogging their own skin with fresh leaves to create warmth through the histamine reaction. Whether this was effective or simply desperate is unclear, but the practice was documented, and it suggests that the plant was abundant wherever the legions went. By the medieval period, this plant was a common green across Europe. It was gathered in spring, when the young shoots were tender. The sting could be neutralized by blanching the leaves in boiling water or by crushing them, which broke the hairs. Once cooked, the leaves were safe to eat, and they were eaten widely, by peasants, by monks, by anyone who needed greens before the garden crops had matured. In England, the plant was so common that it became part of the culinary calendar. Nettle soup, nettle pudding, nettle beer, these were not famine foods. They were seasonal foods, part of the ordinary diet. The poet Thomas Campbell, writing in the 19th century, noted that the plant was eaten by the poor, but he also noted that the rich were fools for avoiding it. The plant's fiber remained economically important into the modern era. During the Napoleonic Wars, when British naval blockades cut off cotton and linen supplies, European textile manufacturers turned to this plant as a substitute. During World War I, when Germany was blockaded and could not import cotton, the German army issued uniforms made from cloth woven from this plant. Harvesting campaigns were organized. Civilians were encouraged to gather the stalks. By some estimates, over 2 million kilograms of fiber were produced from this plant in Germany between 1916 and 1918. But the plant was never easy to harvest. It could not be cut by workers in short sleeves. It required gloves, long clothing, care. Mechanical harvesting was difficult. Machines could cut the stalks, but loading and processing them caused problems. Workers were stung. Productivity was low. When the war ended and cotton became available again, the plant was abandoned. At the same time, its use as food was declining. In the 20th century, as refrigeration and global supply chains made spinach, lettuce, and other greens available year-round, the seasonal imperative to gather wild plants disappeared. People no longer needed to eat what grew in ditches. They could buy what was grown in fields, far away, and shipped in crates. And this plant had a problem. It hurt. Children who touched it cried. Gardeners who brushed against it cursed. Dogs that ran through patches of it yelped and scratched for hours. The plant was aggressive. It spread by rhizomes, underground stems that sent up new shoots at a distance from the parent plant. Once established, it was difficult to eradicate. Any fragment of root left in the soil could regenerate. In urban and suburban landscapes, where control and order were valued, this plant became intolerable. It appeared in parks, in vacant lots, along fence lines. Municipal codes began classifying it as a noxious weed. In some states, it was added to invasive species lists. In others, planting it was prohibited. Herbicides were applied. Mowing campaigns were organized. The goal was eradication. The nutritional content of the plant was irrelevant. The fact that it had fed people for thousands of years was irrelevant. The plant stung. The plant spread. The plant was a weed. By the mid-20th century, this plant had been almost entirely removed from the category of food in North America and much of Europe. It was still gathered by a few, immigrants from countries where the tradition had not been broken, herbalists, foragers. But it was no longer sold in markets. It was not listed in seed catalogs because it did not need to be planted. It grew on its own, whether wanted or not. And increasingly, it was not wanted. The plant did not fail. It did not become less nutritious. It did not lose its ability to grow in poor soil, to return year after year, to produce edible leaves in early spring, when almost nothing else was available. What changed was the system that defined food. And that system had no place for a plant that could not be touched, could not be mechanized, and could not be controlled. In the late 20th century, as organic agriculture and foraging experienced a resurgence, nutritional researchers began analyzing wild plants that had been eaten historically but were no longer part of the modern diet. This plant appeared in those studies. The results were striking. Per 100 grams of fresh leaves, the plant contains approximately 5 to 7 grams of protein, depending on growing conditions and time of harvest. Spinach, by comparison, contains about 2.9 grams, but the comparison is more dramatic when adjusted for calories. The plant is very low in calories, approximately 43 calories per 100 grams. Spinach is also low, at 23 calories per 100 grams. When protein is measured per calorie, this plant delivers roughly 7 times more protein than spinach. The iron content is similarly disproportionate. The plant contains between 4 and 6 milligrams of iron per 100 grams of fresh leaves. Spinach contains about 2.7 milligrams. Per calorie, the plant provides approximately 6 times more iron. Calcium content is also elevated. The plant contains around 480 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams. Kale, often promoted as a calcium-rich green, contains about 150 milligrams. The plant delivers more than 3 times the calcium of kale. It is also dense with vitamins. Vitamin A in the form of beta-carotene is present at levels comparable to carrots. Vitamin C content is high, though it decreases with cooking. Vitamin K, essential for blood clotting and bone health, is present in concentrations that exceed most leafy greens. The plant also contains compounds that have been studied for their biological activity, though the mechanisms are not fully understood. Flavonoids, polyphenols, and other phytochemicals are present in the leaves and have been observed in laboratory studies to have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. But these are not medical claims. They are observations of chemistry. From an agricultural perspective, the plant offers qualities that are rare among food crops. It is perennial. Once established, it returns every year without replanting. It spreads through rhizomes, which means it can be divided and transplanted. It grows in poor soil, in disturbed soil, in soil that has been compacted or depleted. It tolerates shade. It tolerates neglect. The plant's deep roots mine nutrients from subsoil layers, bringing them to the surface. When the leaves are cut and composted, those nutrients are returned to the topsoil, enriching it. This is why the plant is sometimes called a dynamic accumulator. It accumulates minerals from deep in the earth and makes them available to other plants. The plant grows quickly. In spring, new shoots emerge from the rhizomes. Within weeks, they reach 2 to 3 feet in height. The leaves can be harvested at any point before the plant flowers. Once it flowers, the leaves become tougher and less palatable, though they remain nutritious. Harvesting requires care. Gloves are necessary. Some foragers use scissors to cut the top few inches of the plant, avoiding contact with the stems. Others grasp the stem firmly from below and strip the leaves upward. The stinging hairs point upward, so this motion avoids the worst of the sting, though it is not foolproof. Once harvested, the leaves must be processed quickly. Blanching in boiling water for 30 seconds to a minute neutralizes the sting completely. The leaves can then be treated like spinach, sautéed, added to soups, blended into pestos. The flavor is mild, slightly grassy, less bitter than many wild greens. Drying the leaves also neutralizes the sting. Once dried, the plant can be crumbled and used as a powder, added to smoothies, or brewed as tea. This is how the plant is most commonly sold in health food stores: dried, packaged, marketed as a supplement. But the fresh plant, foraged or grown, is more nutrient-dense. The plant is not rare, it is not endangered, it is abundant, sometimes overwhelmingly so. In many regions, it is considered a pest, something to be removed. In others, it is simply ignored, growing in margins and waste places, unrecognized. But it is still there. In ditches, along streams, in the corners of neglected gardens, in forests, in clearings, in soil that has been disturbed by construction or agriculture. Wherever nitrogen accumulates, this plant follows. The knowledge of how to use it, how to harvest it, how to prepare it, that knowledge still exists, though it is fragmented. In Scandinavia, the tradition of eating this plant never fully disappeared. Nettle soup remains a common dish in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. In parts of Eastern Europe, the plant is still gathered in spring and cooked into soups and stews. In the United Kingdom, foraging guides include it. In North America, it is slowly being reclaimed by foragers, herbalists, and gardeners interested in perennial food systems. The plant has a name. It is called stinging nettle. It is easy to recognize once you know what to look for. The leaves are heart-shaped, with serrated edges, arranged in opposite pairs along the stem. The stems are square in cross-section, a characteristic of the mint family, though this plant is not a mint. The hairs are visible if you look closely, translucent, fine, covering the leaves and stems. The flowers are small, greenish, inconspicuous, hanging in clusters from the leaf axils. It grows in spring and early summer, reaching peak height by midsummer, then flowering and beginning to decline. In mild climates, it remains semi-evergreen. In cold climates, it dies back to the roots in winter and returns in spring. To grow it deliberately is a decision that should not be made lightly. The plant spreads. It stings. Once planted, it is permanent. Some gardeners plant it in large containers sunk into the ground to limit its spread. Others plant it in areas where spread is acceptable, along edges, in wild corners, in places where it will not interfere with other crops. But many people do not grow it. They simply know where it grows. And they return to those places each spring with gloves and scissors, and they harvest what the land has provided. Stinging nettle did not fail. It was not replaced by something better. It was rejected because the industrial food system could not accommodate a plant that stings the people who harvest it, that spreads without permission, that cannot be controlled or commodified. But it is still here, growing in the same places it has always grown, waiting, as it has always waited, to be recognized again. The knowledge was always here. We just stopped looking.